There is something quietly extraordinary about waking up one morning and deciding, not dramatically, not with fireworks or grand announcements, but simply deciding, deep in your chest, that you are going to stop surviving your life and actually start living it. That shift, that single, almost invisible turn inward, is what this book is about. And if you have ever stood at a window on a grey Tuesday afternoon and felt that your life was somehow running parallel to you instead of through you, then what Orison Swett Marden wrote in The Joys of Living was written, in many ways, for exactly that moment. For you, for that version of you that is still standing at the window, still wondering, still carrying that quiet ache that does not have a name yet, but that you have been carrying for long enough to know it is real. Marden was not a philosopher who sat in towers and theorized about happiness from a distance. He was a man who had lost everything more than once. He was orphaned young, passed from household to household, given the kind of childhood that would have broken most people entirely. He worked as a servant. He scraped together an education through sheer determination, reading by firelight when books were not available, working 3 jobs to pay for the ones that were. He built businesses and watched them burn down, literally in one case, figuratively in others. He had his health collapse. He had his money run out. He had his plans fall apart in ways that were spectacular and public and humiliating. And yet, through all of that, he arrived at a set of truths about joy that were not borrowed from any comfortable life. They were earned, forged in the particular fire that life seems to reserve for people who are capable of being changed by it. And that is what makes this book feel different from so many others that talk about happiness as though it is simply a choice you make on a Sunday morning when the coffee is good and the sun is out. This is not that kind of book. And this is not going to be that kind of summary. What Marden understood, perhaps more than any writer of his era, was that joy is not a destination. It is not something that waits for you on the other side of success, or on the other side of a promotion, or after the children are grown, or when the debt is finally paid, or when you have figured yourself out, or when the world has calmed down enough to give you permission to relax. Joy is not a reward that you receive when you have finally done enough. Joy is a practice, a way of moving through the world, a quality of attention that you bring to your ordinary, unremarkable, beautifully specific life. And the reason so many people miss it entirely is not because they are unlucky or undeserving. It is because nobody ever taught them how to look. Nobody ever pointed at the ordinary and said, "There. That is where the whole thing lives. Let us start there, at the beginning of everything." Marden opens with an observation that feels almost startlingly simple, and yet, if you sit with it, really sit with it rather than just passing over it, it rearranges something in you. He says that the vast majority of human beings go through their entire lives carrying around a version of themselves that is much smaller than the person they were meant to be. Not smaller in terms of achievement, necessarily, though that too, but smaller in terms of inner experience, smaller in terms of how much they actually feel, how much they actually notice, how much they allow themselves to receive from the world around them. They walk through gardens and do not smell the flowers. They sit across from people they love and are only half present, one eye on the phone, one ear on the worry, the rest of them somewhere between yesterday's regret and tomorrow's to-do list. They eat meals and barely taste them. They hear music and do not listen to it. They live, in other words, at a fraction of their actual capacity for joy, and they have been doing it for so long that the fraction has started to feel normal. And this, Marden argues, is not a character flaw. It is not a sign that something is wrong with you specifically. It is a habit, a deeply ingrained, socially reinforced, almost universally shared habit of contraction. We learn, somewhere along the way, usually in the passage between childhood and adulthood, to make ourselves smaller. We learn to manage our expectations downward. We learn to be reasonable. We learn to be realistic. We learn to stop wanting too much in case we end up disappointed by the gap between what we wanted and what we got. We learn to tuck our delight away so that it does not embarrass us or make us seem naive or leave us vulnerable to the judgment of people who have already decided that that kind of openness is for children. And slowly, without ever making a single dramatic decision to do so, we trade in the wide-open wonder of early life for something narrower, something more defended, something that feels safer but costs us everything that made life worth living in the first place. Think about a child you know, or remember being, the way a 3-year-old interacts with a puddle, the absolute, total, unreserved commitment to the experience of that puddle, the splashing, the laughing, the fascination with the ripples, the complete absence of self-consciousness about the wet shoes, the utter inability to be anywhere else but in that moment, in that puddle, in that uncomplicated, full-body joy. Nobody taught that child to feel that way. No one sat them down and explained the correct amount of enthusiasm to have about standing water. Joy was the natural state, the default setting, and everything, absolutely everything, was a potential doorway into it. Now think about most adults and their relationship to a puddle. Inconvenience, damp socks, a quick calculation about whether the shoes are waterproof and whether there is time to change before the next meeting. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible now over the noise of all that managing and calculating, the echo of something that used to know how to just splash. Just be there. Just enjoy the simple, ridiculous, glorious fact of being alive and standing in the rain. Marden does not tell you to go splash in puddles. He is not sentimental in that particular way, but he does ask you to take seriously the question of when you stopped. When did it happen exactly that you traded presence for management, wonder for caution, the fullness of direct experience for the safety of watching your own life from a careful distance? And more than that, he asks you to consider whether the trade was actually worth it, whether the protection you gained from it is really worth the aliveness you surrendered. Because here is what Marden kept coming back to throughout the entirety of this book: the world has not changed. The capacity for joy has not diminished. The sunsets are still extraordinary. The laughter of a friend is still one of the best sounds a human being can hear. The smell of bread baking is still the smell of bread baking. The feeling of finishing something you worked genuinely hard on is still one of the most satisfying sensations available to a human nervous system. The moment when someone you love walks into a room still has the potential to be the best moment of your day. None of that has gone anywhere. None of that is waiting for better circumstances. What has changed is the quality of your attention to it. And attention, unlike talent, unlike luck, unlike so many of the things we spend our lives imagining that joy depends on, attention is something you can actually work with. It is something you can choose, consciously and deliberately, to cultivate. Now there was a man, a real man, though what matters here is not his name but his story, who spent the better part of his 30s building what he was absolutely certain would make him happy. A successful business, a large house in the right neighborhood, a car that announced his arrival before he even stepped out of it, the kind of life that, from the outside, looked exactly like the picture of success that he had been carrying around in his head since he was a boy watching his own father work himself to exhaustion trying to get close to it. He worked 80-hour weeks and called it dedication. He missed birthdays and called it necessary sacrifice. He told himself, with a sincerity that makes it harder not easier to forgive, that one day, when the business was truly stable, when the mortgage was genuinely manageable, when everything was finally, blessedly in place, then he would start to live. Then he would be present. Then he would take the vacations and read the books and learn to cook properly and be the father his children deserved and the husband his wife had married and the person he himself most wanted to be. One December, His youngest daughter, who was 7 at the time, was asked by her teacher to draw a picture of her family for a class project. She drew her mother, careful and loving, with yellow hair. She drew herself, small and precise, with a red jumper. She drew her older brother with a football under one arm. The teacher, looking at the picture, noticed the absence and asked, quietly, where her father was. The girl thought about it for a moment, with the complete unsentimental honesty that 7-year-olds have not yet learned to soften, and then she said, "He is at work. He is always at work." She did not say it sadly. She did not say it with accusation. She said it the way you describe the weather or the colour of the sky. Just a fact of the world, like gravity, like how winter comes after autumn, like how the sun goes down at 5. That drawing somehow made it to the man's desk. A colleague mentioned it at a dinner. His wife had heard from the school. He sat with it for a long time, and something in him, some wall that had been carefully and extensively maintained for years and years, quietly came down. He did not sell the business. He did not have some cinematic breakdown and run away to find himself on a beach somewhere. What he did was much smaller and, in its smallness, much more radical. He started paying attention. He started genuinely noticing when his daughter laughed. He started actually tasting his food. He started walking to work one morning a week instead of driving, just to feel the season on his face, to be a body moving through the world rather than a brain being transported. He started leaving the office at a specific time and treating that time as sacred. He started, in other words, to practice the skills that Marden wrote about at such length and with such care, the skills of actually receiving your life instead of just managing it from a slight remove. And he will tell you, if you ask him, that those changes, small as they seemed from the outside, unremarkable as they looked from a distance, were the most significant things he ever did. Not because they made him more successful. In some external measures, they made him less so, but because they made him, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely alive. And alive, he found, was the thing he had been working toward all along without realizing it. That is what Marden is after, that quality of aliveness. And he approaches it from so many angles, with so much patience and so much love for the people he is writing to, that you start to feel surrounded by the idea, hemmed in by its generosity, unable to keep pretending that joy is something other people are built for. One of the most important threads running through the joys of living is the relationship between gratitude and perception. Marden was writing at a time long before gratitude became a wellness industry, before the journals and the apps, and the 5 things I am thankful for morning routines that now come pre-formatted in pastel colours. He was writing about something raw and more structural than that. He was writing about the way that what you habitually notice becomes, over time and through the slow alchemy of repetition, the world you actually live in. This is not mysticism, and it is important to be clear about that. It is almost embarrassingly practical once you understand the mechanism. If you spend 10 years training your attention on everything that is wrong, everything that is missing, everything that is threatening, everything that could go wrong and might be going wrong and will probably go wrong before this is all over, you will become extraordinarily good at finding those things. Your brain, which is an astonishing learning machine, will get better and better at the task you keep giving it. And the world you perceive, the world you actually experience in the privacy of your own nervous system, will be genuinely darker and more dangerous and more disappointing than it needs to be. Not because the darkness is not real, it absolutely is, but because you have trained yourself out of the ability to see anything else alongside it. The reverse is equally true, and this is where Marden gets genuinely exciting, where you can feel the electricity of his conviction coming through the page. If you train your attention consistently and with the kind of gentle persistence that does not require perfection, on what is good and working and beautiful and surprising and funny and tender in your life, your brain starts to find those things more readily. The world does not change, but your experience of it does. And your experience of it is, in a very real and irreducible sense, the only world you have ever had access to. Marden uses the word gratitude, but what he means is closer to what we might call attentional discipline, the deliberate, daily, often somewhat effortful choice to bring your focus toward the abundance that already exists in your life, rather than rehearsing the narrative of its absence. He describes people he knew personally, men and women who had very little by any material standard, who nevertheless seemed to radiate a quality of warmth and contentment that made everyone around them feel better simply for having been in the same room with them. People who had grown old without having grown bitter, which is rarer than it sounds. People who had been through genuine difficulty and had come out the other side, not unscathed but undefeated, and somehow more fully themselves for having been tested. And he contrasts them, carefully and specifically, with people who had everything that the world said should make a person happy, and who were nevertheless sour, restless, chronically dissatisfied, always about to be happy, never actually there. Always waiting for the next thing to make them whole. The difference, he observed with the precision of someone who had looked carefully, was not in their circumstances. It was in their habits of mind. It was in what they had trained themselves, through years of daily practice, either conscious or unconscious, to see. This is uncomfortable to sit with, and Marden knew it was uncomfortable, which is why he approaches it with such care. Because it asks something of us. It removes the genuinely comforting excuse that we will be happier when the conditions improve, and it places the weight of our inner experience squarely back in our own hands. But here is the thing. It is also, when you really take it in, one of the most liberating ideas a person can encounter. Because if the quality of your life is largely determined by the quality of your attention, then you are not helpless. You are not at the mercy of fate, or of your upbringing, or of the economy, or of anyone else's choices about how to live. You have agency, genuine, powerful, immediately available agency, over the texture of your inner life. And that agency begins the moment you decide to use it. Marden also writes at considerable length and with unmistakable passion about the life-altering power of enthusiasm, and this is one of the sections of the book that most rewards slow and repeated reading. He is not talking about manufactured positivity. He is not talking about the exhausting performance of upbeat energy that you maintain at the surface while everything underneath churns with a different truth. He despised that kind of performance as much as anyone who had ever had to witness it. What he means by enthusiasm is closer to what the ancient Greeks meant by the word itself, which literally means to be filled with the divine, to be animated by something larger than your small personal fears and preferences, to be genuinely, viscerally, sometimes uncomfortably engaged with the thing you are doing. He tells us that enthusiasm is not something you either have or do not have, not some personality trait distributed unequally at birth that some people got and others missed. It is something that follows engagement. It is something that follows commitment. It is something that arrives, with a reliability that can be counted on once you understand the mechanism, when you stop holding yourself back from your own life and actually dive in. The person who goes halfway into a task, 1 foot in and 1 foot carefully, defensively out, who does the minimum required and no more, who protects themselves from caring too much because caring too much seems naive or risky or destined to end in disappointment, that person will almost never feel enthusiastic about anything. Not because they were born without the capacity for it, but because enthusiasm is a response to full engagement, and full engagement is precisely what they have been strategically withholding. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but utterly useful, of a young woman who wanted to become a painter. She had real talent, genuine, undeniable, the kind that several people who knew about these things had already quietly remarked on. But she was afraid of failing publicly, afraid of discovering that she was not quite as good as she had allowed herself to hope, afraid of the peculiar vulnerability of making something with your whole heart and then having it exist in the world where anyone could look at it and find it lacking. So she painted only in private, small canvases, hidden away in a studio that no one else ever entered. She took a job she did not love, administrative work in a firm that handled things she did not care about, and she painted in stolen hours, always holding back just a little, always keeping the best and most honest part of herself in reserve, always on the verge of really starting, never quite there. One day, a friend persuaded her to take a community art class, just a class, no pressure, just to get out of the house, to be around other people who cared about making things. She went reluctantly, the way you agree to things that you know are good for you while secretly hoping they will be cancelled. The teacher, an older woman who had been painting for 50 years without apology and without particular fame and without any apparent awareness that either of those things was supposed to matter, looked at the young woman's careful, technically accomplished, somehow bloodless work and said something she never forgot. She said, "You are painting like someone who is afraid of the paint. You are so worried about getting it wrong that you have not yet let yourself get it right. Stop being careful. Start making a mess. The best work always comes from the mess." Something unlocked in her that day, not completely, not all at once, but enough. She started painting bigger, more recklessly, with a willingness to fail that she had not had before, because she had decided on the drive home from that class that the failure she was most afraid of was not the failure of making bad art. It was the failure of spending her whole life making safe art. She ruined more canvases in the next 6 months than she had in the previous 6 years, and she also produced, somewhere in that gloriously imperfect mess, the work that eventually got her into her first public exhibition, the work that people actually stopped in front of, the work that felt alive, because it had been made by someone who had decided, finally, to be fully present in the making. Marden would have recognized that story immediately, because it captures exactly what he was trying to say about enthusiasm and engagement and the particular courage required to stop protecting yourself from your own life. The mess is not the enemy of the good work. The mess, the willingness to fail and fail differently and try again, is where the good work lives. And the careful, defended, always holding back approach to life, however sensible it feels from the inside, is the thing that keeps us at a permanent safe distance from the experience of being fully, embarrassingly, gloriously alive. He goes on to apply this principle with remarkable consistency to every domain of life, to relationships, where holding back is so often mistaken for wisdom and so often is, in fact, just fear wearing a sensible coat, where the impulse to protect yourself from being hurt ends up protecting you with equal efficiency from being known, to work where going the extra mile is so often dismissed as naive by people who have decided that investment without guaranteed return is for fools, when actually it is the only way to ever feel genuinely proud of what you have done. To the simple daily experiences of being human, the meal, the conversation, the walk, the morning, the unremarkable Tuesday, all of which are transformed almost beyond recognition by the quality of presence you are willing to bring to them. The concept of usefulness runs very deep in Marden's thinking about joy, and I want to give it the space it deserves. He was writing in an era when the idea that personal fulfillment might have something to do with service to others was not yet fashionable in the tradition of writing about success. Most of the success literature of his time was ruthlessly individualistic in the particular way that era allowed. Get more, climb higher, beat the competition, be the man who wins. Marden was not interested in any of that, at least not as an end in itself. He was interested in it only insofar as it served something larger, the development of a human being who could genuinely contribute to the world around them, who could look back at the end of their time here and feel honestly that they had left something behind worth having left. He believed, with the quiet, unperformative conviction that does not need an audience, that the deepest joys available to human beings are almost always connected to usefulness, to the sense that your presence here matters, that you are not just consuming your life but actively contributing to it, that the people around you are better, even in some small and unrecorded way, for having had you in it. That you have put something into the world, whether in the form of work or of kindness or of love or of honest effort, that would not have been there without you. That you were not just a passenger. This is not altruism in the self-denying, white-knuckled, joy-eliminating sense of the word. It is not the joyless performance of good deeds for the sake of the performance, which Marden had no patience for at all. It is something warmer and more natural than any of that. It is the recognition that human beings are fundamentally social creatures, that we are wired at the deepest level for connection and contribution, and that when we live in alignment with that wiring, when we stop trying to contract inward toward the self as the sole source of meaning and allow ourselves to be genuinely useful to the people around us, something clicks into place that no amount of solitary achievement can replicate. Something that feels less like earning a reward and more like coming home. Think about the moments in your own life when you felt most alive, most fully yourself, most genuinely content in a way that did not require any explanation or justification. Most of them, if you are being honest with yourself, probably involved other people in some essential way. A conversation that went somewhere real and stayed there. A moment when you helped someone navigate something difficult and saw the relief settle across their face like weather clearing. A time when you made someone laugh until they were helpless with it. A moment when you said exactly the right thing to someone who needed to hear it and could not have found it themselves. A time when you showed up for someone who did not expect you to, and felt the particular warmth that comes from having surprised someone with your generosity. These moments of genuine human usefulness, of being genuinely needed and genuinely present and genuinely helpful, they are among the most joy-saturated experiences available to us. And yet we overlook them constantly, treat them as peripheral to the real project of our lives, in favour of chasing the bigger, louder, more socially legible markers of a good life. The promotions, the acquisitions, the public recognitions, the milestones. Marden would not have been against any of those things, but he would have asked you, gently and persistently, whether those things were actually what you had been hungry for, or whether you had simply reached for them because they were the things that other people seemed to be reaching for. And there is something here about the small acts of usefulness, the ones that never get recorded and never earn recognition and never make it into any public accounting of what you did with your time here, that Marden found especially precious. The kind word given to a stranger who looked like they needed one and did not know how to ask for it. The extra care taken with a piece of work that no one would have noticed if you had skimped on it, care taken not for the audience but for the integrity of the thing itself. The attention paid to someone who had grown accustomed to being invisible, the patience extended to someone who had not quite earned it, but who needed it. These small, private, unglamorous, utterly unspectacular acts of human decency, he argued, do more for the soul of the person doing them than most of the grand public gestures we spend our lives rehearsing and performing. There is a reason this feels true, even when every rational part of us wants to dismiss it as too simple. There is something in the quiet sincerity of an unseen kindness that feeds something in us that praise and recognition and the admiration of other people simply cannot touch. It connects us to our own better nature, to the version of ourselves that we most respect when we are being honest. It reminds us, in a way that nothing else quite manages, of who we actually are beneath all the performance and the strategy and the management. And it is available, always, immediately, to every single person regardless of their circumstances. The wealthiest person and the most financially constrained person have identical access to kindness, to genuine attention, to being useful in the small and human ways that turn out to be the most significant ways of all. Around what feels like the emotional midpoint of this book, Marden turns his attention to something that most happiness literature either avoids entirely or handles with such delicacy that it ends up saying nothing useful. He turns to the role of difficulty, of struggle, of genuine hardship in the life of a person who wishes to live joyfully, and he does not flinch, because he could not have afforded to flinch. He had too much personal history with the subject. He had lived through losses that would have permanently darkened most people's outlook on the world. He had experienced failure not once as a temporary setback, but repeatedly, at different stages of life, in different domains, with different flavours of pain each time. He had known poverty, not the theoretical poverty that people use as a rhetorical device, but the actual experience of not knowing how the next week would be managed. He had known loneliness. He had known the specific grief of watching something you built with enormous effort and genuine love fall apart. And yet what he found, again and again, both in his own experience and in the lives of the people he most deeply admired, was that it was precisely the difficult passages, the ones that felt at the time like catastrophes, that had most enlarged them, that the setbacks had forced an opening that comfort could never have created, that the losses had produced a depth, a richness of inner life, a capacity for genuine understanding and compassion, that nothing comfortable could have grown. He is not saying that suffering is good. He is not one of those writers who romanticizes pain or suggests that you should be grateful for your trauma in some glib and insulting way. That kind of sentiment would have disgusted him. His argument is more nuanced and more practically useful than that. It is that difficulty, when met with the right kind of inner orientation, with curiosity rather than pure resentment, with the question, what is this trying to teach me, rather than the verdict, this should not be happening, has the capacity to become one of the most powerful teachers available to a human life. That is not the same as saying the difficulty should be welcomed. It is saying that what you do with it after it arrives is the thing that matters most. The question is not whether the hard things will come. They will. For everyone without exception, across every level of privilege and advantage and careful planning. The question is what you do when they arrive. Do you close down, contract into bitterness, rage against the injustice of it, and make yourself increasingly brittle in the process, until eventually you reach a stage where even the good things cannot get in because the walls you built against the bad things do not distinguish? Or do you find some way, perhaps slowly and imperfectly, to allow the experience to move through you, to change you in the ways it is trying to change you, to ask you the questions it is forcing you to ask, and to come out the other side with something you could not have had without going through it? This is one of the deepest things Marden writes about, and it connects to a quality he calls resilience, though he expresses it in different language that is perhaps more intimate and less clinical. He describes it as the capacity to take the full weight of life's experiences, not just the pleasant ones, and to metabolize them into wisdom rather than bitterness. To let what happens to you inform you without allowing it to define you. To be changed by your experience, which is inevitable and appropriate, without being consumed by it. To remain, at the deepest level, a person who leans toward life. He gives the example of a man he knew personally, a businessman who had built a considerable fortune through years of genuine effort and intelligent risk-taking, and who lost it all in the space of a single week due to circumstances largely outside his control. A partner's betrayal, a market collapse, a series of cascading misfortunes that arrived with the particular cruelty of things that happen all at once. The man was in his mid-50s. He had nothing. He had to start again, not from the beginning, because a person of 55 cannot go back to the beginning, but from whatever this new place was. This unfamiliar, humbling, frightening place of having to rebuild. And he did rebuild, not because he was made of something fundamentally different from other men, not because he had some secret reserve of superhuman strength, but because he had developed, over years of conscious and sometimes uncomfortable inner work, the habit of asking a particular question in any difficulty. Not why is this happening to me, which is the natural first response, and an entirely understandable one, and one that he had certainly felt. But what is this making possible? What is this opening up that would not have been open before? What can be built now that could not have been built before this happened? It is a small shift in framing. It looks almost too small to matter, but it is, as Marden understood, the difference between being imprisoned by what has happened and being informed by it, between being a victim of your circumstances and being a person who moves through their circumstances, however harsh, with some measure of agency and forward momentum intact. The man went on to build something new, smaller in scale perhaps, but built on a foundation of experience and self-knowledge, and earned humility that his younger, more confident, less seasoned self could never have laid. He told Marden that the loss, as devastating and disorienting as it had been, had given him back to himself in a way that success never had. It had stripped away the things he had been performing and left only the things he actually was. And he'd been surprised and quietly, genuinely grateful to discover that what remained was enough. More than enough, actually, to build a life on. If you are listening to this, and you are in a difficult passage right now, if you are in the middle of something that you cannot yet see the other side of, if you are carrying something that is heavier than you are comfortable admitting, Marden would want you to know this. The difficulty is not evidence that you are doing it wrong. It is not proof that you are not meant for more. It is not the universe's verdict on your worth as a human being. It is, most often, if you can stay open enough to let it be, the precise instrument by which the person you are becoming is being shaped. And the shaping hurts. Of course it does. That is what shaping is. But the shape that emerges, if you stay soft enough to be shaped, rather than brittle enough to shatter, that shape is the one that was always most truly yours. Now, please, take a moment here, if this is speaking to something in you, to like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library. It genuinely matters to the channel and to everyone who made this content possible. Your subscription means that more people find these ideas when they need them most. It keeps this work alive and growing. So, if you are getting value from this, which I hope you are, go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and let us keep going, because the best parts of this book are still ahead of us. The heart of what Marden has to say, the very centre of this extraordinary book, has to do with what he calls the art of living, by which he means something very specific and very demanding. He means the cultivation of those inner qualities, those habits of mind and heart and attention that allow a person to extract genuine richness from whatever life places in front of them. Not just from the obviously good things, not just from the celebrations and the triumphs and the beautiful days, from everything, from the Tuesday afternoons as much as the great victories, from the quiet conversations as much as the memorable events, from the small ordinary moments that, if you do the arithmetic honestly, make up the vast majority of any human life actually lived. He writes about what it means to be genuinely present with a particular urgency that is not dated at all, despite the fact that he was writing more than a century ago. If anything, the urgency feels sharper now, more immediately relevant, in an age of fragmented attention and relentless digital distraction, in an age when it is genuinely possible, and most people exercise this possibility daily, to go through an entire day without ever being fully, completely, unhurriedly present in a single moment of it. To spend breakfast checking news, to spend the commute inside a screen, to eat lunch while answering messages, to spend the evening half watching something while half scrolling through something else. To get to the end of a day and realize, with a quiet unease that most people have learned to dismiss without examining, that you have no particular memory of having been in any of it. He understood this tendency with perfect clarity, even without being able to name the specific technologies that would eventually make it so much worse. He understood that the mind, left to its own devices, without deliberate cultivation of presence, tends to live everywhere except where the body is. In the past, rehearsing old grievances. In the future, running elaborate simulations of things that probably will not happen or cannot be controlled if they do. Everywhere, in other words, except the only place where life is actually taking place, which is here, which is now, which is the conversation you are half having while you think about something else. Presence, for Marden, is not a spiritual achievement reserved for people who have achieved some advanced state of inner development. It is not something you have to earn. It is a practical skill, available to anyone who decides to practice it, that transforms the quality of every experience you have by the simple mechanism of actually being there for it. When you are truly present with another person, not performing listening while actually waiting for your turn to speak, but genuinely there, they feel it. The conversation becomes real in a way it simply cannot be when you are half somewhere else. When you are truly present with your work, something comes through you that cannot come through distraction. A quality of attention, a capacity for genuine problem-solving and genuine creativity that is simply unavailable to the divided mind. When you are truly present in your own body, in your own life, in your own ordinary morning, the world becomes more vivid, more specific, more textured and particular and genuinely yours. He describes a woman he met once, a school teacher in a small town who had the reputation of being the most extraordinary person that community had ever produced. Not extraordinary in any grand or public sense. She had never travelled farther than 2 counties over. She had no fame, no particular wealth, no achievements that would have meant anything to a newspaper. She had lived her entire life within a 20-mile radius of where she was born, teaching children and tending her garden and attending to the daily business of her small and, to all outward appearances, perfectly ordinary life. But people came from surrounding towns to spend an afternoon with her. They described leaving her company feeling more alive, more clear about what mattered to them, more capable of their own lives. They could not always explain what it was that she had done. The conversations were not particularly dramatic. She had not given them advice that was especially original or solutions that were especially clever. What she had given them was harder to name and more valuable than any of those things. She had been completely there. When she listened to you with every part of herself. When she laughed without calculation, without checking whether the laugh was appropriate to the occasion. When she was quiet, the quiet was full rather than merely empty. She had mastered, without any formal instruction and apparently without great effort, the art of being fully in her own life, fully in each moment of it, fully available to whoever was in the room with her. And the presence she brought to every encounter was so rare and so nourishing and so profoundly unlike the divided, distracted performance of presence that most of us offer each other most of the time, that people were drawn to it the way cold things are drawn to warmth. Because it was like warmth. Because most of us are so consistently starved of genuine presence, so accustomed to being half attended to, that when we encounter the real thing, Something in us recognizes it immediately and responds with a gratitude that sometimes surprises us with its intensity. Marden says, and this is one of the lines worth writing down and putting somewhere you will see it, that a person who is fully present in a small life is richer, in every way that ultimately matters, than a distracted person in a grand one. And he means this with complete and unironic seriousness. The size of your outer life is far less important to your actual experience of joy than the quality of your inner life. And the quality of your inner life is, to a degree that is both humbling and energizing, a function of how present you are willing to be in it. He also writes with great seriousness about the relationship between joy and physical health, which was, for a man writing in the late 19th century, ahead of his time in ways that are interesting to notice. He was writing before modern neuroscience gave us language for the body-mind connection, before we understood how profoundly the condition of the body affects the condition of the inner life, before sleep science and the microbiome and the vagus nerve became subjects of common conversation. But he understood, from close observation and from his own experience of physical collapse and recovery, that the body and the mind are not two separate systems running in polite parallel. They are one system, and the condition of one propagates through the other in ways that are constant and insistent and cannot ultimately be ignored. He encourages, without being preachy or prescriptive about it, a basic and humble care for the physical self. Not the obsessive, performance-oriented, optimization-driven relationship with the body that our contemporary culture sometimes promotes, where the body becomes another project to be optimized rather than a home to be inhabited. But the simpler, more compassionate understanding that a body that is neglected will eventually make its dissatisfaction known in ways that colonize your capacity for joy. You cannot think clearly, feel deeply, love fully, work with engagement, or be present in any meaningful sense if you are chronically exhausted, chronically underfed, chronically deprived of movement and fresh air and the small physical pleasures that a body was designed to receive. He writes with particular warmth, and you can hear his own genuine preference in it, about the outdoors, about the restorative power of being in natural settings, which he saw not as a luxury item for people with leisure time, but as a genuine and rather urgent necessity for the health of the human spirit. He describes early morning walks as a kind of medicine that cannot be compounded in any pharmacy. He describes the way that time spent under an open sky, in the presence of growing things, in the particular quality of air that exists outside of buildings, has a capacity to reorient a person toward what is true and essential that no amount of indoor philosophy can replicate. There is something about nature's indifference to our small human dramas, its enormous, patient, completely inhuman continuity, that does something useful to our perspective on our own anxieties. The trees do not care about your email inbox. The river does not know about your deadline. The morning sky has not heard about your worst fear and would not change its colour if it had. And sitting with that fact, really sitting with it rather than just noting it in passing, has a way of loosening the grip of the things that seem so urgent and so heavy and so defining inside the four walls of your ordinary life. It does not make the problems go away, it simply restores them to their actual size, which is almost always smaller than the size they had assumed inside your head. Now, the section of this book that perhaps surprised me most, on reflection, is the one where Marden takes on the question of work and joy, because here he makes a claim that cuts directly against a very common and very appealing modern narrative. He does not say that the key to joy is to find work you love so that you never have to work a day in your life. He is not peddling that particular, seductive, often paralyzing myth, which has the effect of making anyone who cannot identify their passion feel that they are somehow failing at the fundamental task of being a human being. What he says is something far more practical and far more immediately achievable, which is that the capacity for joy in work is not primarily about the content of the work at all. It is about the quality of the mind you bring to it. He had known men who did repetitive, physically demanding, unglamorous labour, and who found deep satisfaction in it. Not because the work was glamorous or meaningful in the way we tend to use that word now, but because they brought something genuine to it. They cared about it not in spite of its ordinariness, but through it. They took a real and unperformed pride in doing it well, in the quality of the result, in the integrity of the effort, regardless of whether anyone was watching. They found in the rhythm of it a kind of meditation, a fullness of attention that produced, at the end of each day, the clean and uncomplicated satisfaction of someone who has given themselves fully to something. And he had known men who did interesting, important, well-compensated, socially prestigious work, who were genuinely miserable, who went through the motions with a listlessness that no salary could compensate for, who watched the clock, who produced the minimum required and called it professional, who saw their work as a transaction to be managed rather than a contribution to be made. The difference was not in the work, the difference was in the worker. Specifically, in the degree to which the worker was willing to actually inhabit their work rather than merely perform it from a safe distance. And here Marden makes a point that is worth sitting with for a moment. He says that most people dramatically underestimate how much of their life is their work. If you are spending 40, 50, 60 hours a week doing something, and you are spending those hours in a state of low-grade resentment and disconnection and clock-watching, you have made the choice, perhaps unconsciously, but no less really for that, to spend the dominant portion of your waking life in a form of mild suffering. Whereas if you can find a way, even gradually and imperfectly, to bring genuine engagement and genuine care to what you do, regardless of whether the work itself is what you would have chosen if you had been given complete freedom of choice, you transform not just your experience of work, but the entire quality of your daily life. He is not saying stay in situations that are genuinely harmful. He is not saying be grateful for unfair treatment or pretend that bad conditions are fine. He has too much basic respect for the people he is writing to for any of that. What he is saying is that the first transformation available to you is almost always an inner one. That before you change your circumstances, which you absolutely may need to do, consider changing the quality of attention and intention and genuine care that you bring to your current circumstances, not as a permanent substitute for change, as the foundation from which genuine change, the kind that actually holds, can grow. This leads naturally into one of the most beautiful passages in the entire book, which concerns the relationship between purpose and joy. Not the kind of purpose that is assigned or inherited or borrowed from what other people seem to want, but the deeper, more personal, more specifically, individual sense of being aligned with something that is genuinely yours. Something that makes use of who you most essentially are, in a way that feels, if you are honest about it, less like ambition and more like recognition. Marden believed, and you can feel the depth of this belief in every line he writes about it, that human beings are not fully alive until they have found something larger than themselves to serve. Not in a religious sense, necessarily, but in the functional sense that a life organized entirely around its own comfort and its own advancement and its own image maintenance is a life that will perpetually feel hollow, because it is hollow. The self alone was never designed to be enough to fill a life. The self needs to be in service of something it believes in, something that makes a demand on the best of what it has to offer. He describes purpose not as a single dramatic calling that you either find, like a treasure map leading to a specific buried chest, or fail to find and therefore fail at life. He is far too sensible for that. He describes it as something that can be discovered and refined gradually, through sustained attention and honest self-examination, and the repeated, courageous willingness to ask the question, what is most needed, and what am I most genuinely, most specifically, most unusually suited to offer in response to that need? He believed that every person had something genuine to contribute, not as a comforting platitude designed to make everyone feel special, but as a practical and observable fact. Every person has a particular configuration of gifts and experiences and temperament and accumulated history that makes them, if they are paying attention, uniquely positioned to do some specific thing well and with love, and with a quality of investment that no one else could quite replicate. Finding that thing, or rather, moving honestly and with gradually increasing courage toward it, is one of the central tasks and one of the deepest pleasures of a life consciously lived. And living in alignment with it is one of the most consistent sources of joy that Marden had ever encountered. He tells the story of a man who spent 20 years in a profession that paid well and that other people found impressive, and that left him, at the close of every working day, with the quiet, persistent, impossible-to-ignore feeling that he had spent the day wearing someone else's life. He was competent at his work, more than competent. He was, by external measures, successful. But he had a low-level sense of wrongness about it all, a feeling that he was living adjacent to his actual life rather than inside it. He ignored this feeling for a long time, because it seemed ungrateful to acknowledge it. He had so much. His complaints would have seemed incomprehensible to many people he knew. Who was he to want something different? One evening, quite by accident, he ended up helping a young boy in his neighborhood understand a mathematics problem that had been defeating him. The boy had been told by multiple teachers that he simply was not mathematical, and he had begun to believe it about himself with the thorough and terrible conviction that children have for the things adults repeat enough times. The man sat down with him and spent 2 hours not drilling him in formulas but playing with numbers, finding the stories inside the equations, making the underlying logic feel like a discovery rather than a rule to be memorized. The boy's face, at the exact moment something clicked, at the moment the confusion dissolved and was replaced by genuine understanding, did something to the man that nothing in his 20-year career had ever done. It reached into some part of him that had been waiting to be reached into and pulled something awake. He did not quit his job the next morning. He was not impulsive, and he had real responsibilities, and he understood that life requires patience. But he started volunteering. 1 evening a week, then 2. He started reading about education in the small hours when the house was quiet. He started paying careful attention to what it was about teaching, specifically about the moment when a confused mind becomes a clear one, that produced in him the sense of being genuinely, completely, usefully himself. And over the next several years he made a transition, not dramatic, not overnight, not without genuine sacrifice and real uncertainty, but deliberate and purposeful, toward a life that felt, for the first time in as long as he could remember, genuinely his. He took a significant pay cut. People thought he was having a crisis. His father was worried in the particular way that fathers who worked hard to give their children security feel worried when that security is voluntarily relinquished. And he was, for the first time in his adult life, in possession of something that he had not even had the right language for before, a bedrock, quiet, ordinary, daily contentment. The kind that does not require explanation or justification, the kind that is simply there, like the ground under your feet, solid and reliable and unremarkable and absolutely everything. Marden writes also, with a gentleness that is almost tender, about the joy that lives in simplicity. This is perhaps the part of the book that most consistently challenges our contemporary instincts, because we live inside an economic and cultural system that is organized at a structural level around the proposition that more is better, and that desire should always be directed toward the next thing, around upgrade, around the persistent, beautifully manufactured restlessness that keeps entire industries alive. And Marden, from his vantage point, in an earlier era that was organizing itself around exactly the same logic, looks at this tendency with something that is equal parts amusement and sorrow, because he had already watched it play out in the lives of the people around him. He had already seen how it ended. It ended in more wanting, it ended in the horizons of satisfaction perpetually retreating at exactly the speed you could chase them. It ended in people who had acquired everything they had ever told themselves they needed and still felt, in the quiet moments, that something essential was absent. What was absent, he says, and he says it gently because he is not trying to shame anyone, only to redirect their attention, was the quality of presence to the things they already had. The meal shared with someone you love, the afternoon with nothing required of it but reading and rest. The hour spent doing something with your hands that produces, at its end, a tangible thing you actually made. The conversation that wanders without agenda and lasts until it has said what it needed to say. The morning coffee in the particular quality of early light. These are the experiences that accumulate in the richest part of memory, the ones that you find yourself returning to years later, not because they were expensive or impressive, but because they were real, because you were actually there for them, because something in you recognizes them as the actual substance of a life, not the accessories. But let us talk for a moment about something that Marden weaves throughout the whole book, almost like a thread of gold running through fabric, something you might miss on first reading if you are moving too quickly. He writes about the quality of attention we bring to beauty, not the grand beauty of famous landscapes or works of art in famous museums, though those too, but the daily, ordinary, utterly available beauty that most of us walk past without stopping, the colour of the sky at a specific moment, the particular way light falls across a kitchen floor in the late afternoon, the sound of rain before it begins, that smell of the world getting ready, the face of someone you love when they do not know you are looking. These are not small things. Marden would have very strong feelings about calling them small. They are, he says, the actual texture of a life. They are what the life is made of, and the person who has trained themselves to receive them, who has built the habit of pausing for the beauty that presents itself unrequested, and without ceremony, that person is living in a richer world than someone who has far more in material terms, but has let the habit of noticing go fallow. He talks about what he calls the educated senses, by which he means not any rarefied aesthetic training, but simply the practice of being awake to sensory experience, of tasting food slowly enough to actually taste it, of listening to music with the part of you that is not also making a grocery list, of touching the things you touch, the worn cover of a book you love, the rough bark of a tree, the hand of a child who trusts you enough to reach for yours, with enough presence to actually register the experience. He believed that the capacity to receive sensory pleasure, simple, immediate, inexpensive, always available sensory pleasure, was one of the most undervalued resources a human being possessed, and that most people were walking around with this enormous, entirely free source of joy almost completely switched off, because they had never been taught to switch it on, or because the busyness of their lives had gradually crowded it out. There is a small story he tells that I want to share because it lodged itself in me. A very old man, someone Marden had known since his youth, was lying ill in bed in the final weeks of his life. Marden visited him one afternoon and found him lying with his eyes closed and a particular quality of peace on his face that was not resignation but something more active than that, more intentional. Marden asked him quietly what he was doing, and the old man opened his eyes and said he was remembering. Not the great events of his life, not the achievements or the public recognitions or the moments that would have made it into any official account of who he was. He was remembering specific afternoons from decades ago, the smell of a particular orchard in spring, the feeling of cold water on his hands after a long day of outdoor work, the laughter of a woman he had loved at some joke he could no longer remember the content of, the specific light on a specific evening in a specific town where he had been young and not yet burdened with knowing how much time costs. These were the things, he told Marden, that he kept coming back to, not because they were the best things that had happened to him, because they were the most real, because he had been present for them, because in those moments, whatever they were, he had been fully there, and in being fully there had actually received them, and they had therefore become, in some important sense, permanently his. Marden left that bedside with something he never lost, the understanding that the moments we are actually present for are the moments that become real and lasting and genuinely ours. And the moments we are only half present for, the meals eaten while scrolling, the conversations conducted while distracted, the evenings spent half watching something, the slow erosion of presence into management, those moments do not accumulate into a life. They accumulate into a vague sense that time is passing, which is a very different thing. He writes about friendship with a precision that feels particularly valuable because it goes against the grain of how we usually talk about it. He says that the capacity for deep friendship is one of the clearest indicators of a person's capacity for joy. Not because friends simply make us feel good, though they do, but because genuine friendship requires and therefore cultivates the exact qualities that joy requires. The willingness to be truly known by another person, which is one of the most vulnerable and most vital experiences available to us. The courage to be honest, even when honesty is inconvenient. The generosity to give time and attention and care without keeping careful score. The humility to receive what another person offers without dismissing it. The patience to remain present through the difficult passages of another person's life rather than withdrawing when the complexity becomes uncomfortable. All of these things, practiced in the context of real friendship, develop in us exactly the qualities that make joy possible in every other area of life too. He also writes about love, in the broad and foundational sense that he means it, as the orientation that makes everything else possible. Not romantic love specifically, though that is included, but the general quality of warmth and generosity and good faith with which you choose, day by day and moment by moment, to meet the world. The habit of assuming that the person in front of you is doing their best, the instinct to offer the benefit of the doubt rather than the withholding of it. The tendency to look for what is good in a situation, a person, a day, before deciding on what is lacking. This orientation, this quality of basic loving generosity toward the world is, Marden says, the single most transformative thing a person can cultivate. More than any specific skill or achievement, more than any outward change in circumstances, a person who moves through the world in a fundamentally loving orientation has access to a quality of daily experience that cannot be purchased and cannot be taken away because it is not located in anything outside of them. He is realistic about this. He does not pretend it is easy or that it does not sometimes require an active choice that does not come naturally, but he argues from a lifetime of watching people and attending to the evidence that it is worth the effort, not just for the people who receive it, for the person who practices it. A life lived in genuine generosity and warmth is a warmer and more generous life to be living in. The kindness you extend changes the quality of your own experience. This is not mysticism. It is the simple consequence of the fact that you are always present for your own behavior, and behaving in ways that are aligned with your best values has a direct and immediate effect on how you feel about the person you are. Marden turns, in the later sections of the book, to the inner voice, the narrator that lives inside each of us and provides running commentary on everything that happens. including and especially on who we are, and whether we are good enough, and whether we are adequate to the demands of the life we are trying to live. He had noticed, with characteristic precision, that most people are dramatically harder on themselves in private than they would ever dream of being to another person. They apply to themselves a standard of judgment that is not just demanding but often genuinely cruel. They rehearse their failures with a fidelity and a frequency that they do not bring to their successes. They find the critical voice much easier to believe than the compassionate one, as though the harshness of it was somehow evidence of its accuracy. And he makes the point with the clarity of someone who has thought about it carefully. This inner narrative is not a neutral description of reality. It is a lens, and the lens shapes what becomes possible. A person who has absorbed, deep in their inner monologue, the belief that they are fundamentally inadequate, that they do not deserve the good things, that they are likely to fail, will act in ways that confirm that belief. Not because the belief is accurate, but because it shapes the behavior that produces the outcome, and they mistake the outcome for proof that they were right all along, when actually the belief created the outcome through the behavior it generated. He advocates for something that we might now call self-compassion, though his language is different. He advocates for speaking to yourself in the interior conversation that never stops, the way you would speak to a good friend who is struggling and imperfect and doing their best with what they have. With honesty, yes, with a willingness to name clearly what needs to change and why, but also with the basic, unhysterical assumption that you are a person of worth who is doing their best with what they have, and that their best is, and will remain, something real to work with. Because a person who has that basic inner faith, who can make mistakes and acknowledge them without collapsing into self-condemnation, who can fail and not lose their sense of their own fundamental worth, has a freedom of action and a resilience in difficulty that the relentlessly self-critical person will never access. The inner critic does not produce better performance. It produces paralysis and avoidance and the particular exhaustion of someone who is fighting themselves as hard as they are fighting their problems. The final major theme of the book is what Marden calls hope, and I want to be precise about what he means by it, because hope has become a word that is easy to misuse. What he does not mean is passive optimism, the comfortable assumption that things will work out without any particular effort on your part. What he does not mean is the refusal to plan, or the willful ignorance of risk, or the sentimental insistence that everything happens for a reason in a way that requires you to never feel the full weight of what is hard. None of that. What he means by hope is something active and disciplined and, in his telling, genuinely practical. He means the cultivated, practiced, constantly renewed habit of expecting that good things are possible, of orienting toward what could be built rather than dwelling on what has been lost, of remaining open to the future rather than treating it as a foregone conclusion based on the worst of the past. And he distinguishes this from naivety by insisting that it must be paired with clear-eyed honesty about difficulty. Real hope, the kind that actually sustains people through the genuinely hard passages, is not denial. It is the choice, made again and again in the face of real evidence for its opposite, to remain oriented toward the possible. And he argues that this is not just emotionally preferable, it is functionally superior. A hopeful person behaves differently in the world. They persist longer when results are delayed. They try more things when the first approach fails. They are more creative in the face of problems because they approach problems as things that can be solved rather than as sentences to be served. They attract collaboration because other people, given the choice, want to be around someone who believes that things can be better, that effort matters, that the future is not already decided, and the results they produce, in the aggregate and over time, tend to validate their hope, not because the universe rewards optimism as a favour, but because hopeful behaviour, in a world that is genuinely probabilistic rather than fixed, tends over time to produce outcomes that confirm what the hopeful person believed was possible. Marden closes this extraordinary book with an invitation that is also a challenge, in the way that the best invitations always are. He invites us to begin. Not to wait until we are ready, because readiness, as anyone who has waited for it knows, is largely a fiction we use to avoid the discomfort of starting. Not to wait until conditions are more favourable, because conditions are never perfect, and the perfect conditions are among the most effective traps ever devised by the part of us that fears change. Not to wait until we have fully understood everything Marden is saying, because understanding in this domain comes from practice, not from comprehension. He says, and you can feel the warmth of someone who genuinely wants good things for you in every line, begin now, with the life you have, in the circumstances you are actually in, with the tools that are genuinely available to you, not the tools you wish you had. Begin the practice of paying attention to what is good. Begin the practice of bringing genuine engagement to what is in front of you. Begin the practice of being useful in the small and daily and unglamorous ways that turn out to be the ones that matter most. Begin the practice of speaking to yourself with the voice you would use for someone you love. Begin the practice of expecting that good things are possible, because they are. The joys of living, he says, in the line that the whole book has been building toward, are not exotic or rare or waiting behind some future achievement. They are present in the texture of your ordinary days, woven into the fabric of the life you are actually living, available in the next conversation and the next meal and the next moment of attention you are willing to give. You do not have to earn them. You do not have to deserve them. You have to notice them. You have to be there for them. You have to stop for long enough to actually receive what your life is already offering and let it be enough. Because it is enough. It has always been enough. The only question, and it is the question that this whole remarkable book asks with such care and such persistence and such genuine love for the reader, is whether you will be present enough to know it. There is one more dimension of this book that deserves its own space before we close, because it is the one that ties everything else together in a way that Marden himself would have considered the most important of all. It is what he writes about the renewal of the inner life, not a one-time renewal, not a transformation that you accomplish and then file away, but the ongoing, daily, seasonal, rhythmic practice of returning to yourself, of checking in with your own depths, of ensuring that the outer life, which always tends to expand to fill all available space and then some, is still rooted in something genuine, something that actually belongs to you. He had observed, with the mixture of sadness and compassion that characterizes his best writing, that many people in the middle decades of their lives reach a point where they have become almost entirely externalized, where their sense of themselves exists almost entirely in terms of their roles and their responsibilities and their obligations and their social identities: father, mother, employee, employer, neighbour, colleague, all real, all important, all genuinely part of who they are. But not the whole, never the whole. And the person who has lost contact with the part of themselves that exists before and beneath all those roles, who cannot find their way back to the quiet interior place where something knows its own name without having to consult a title or a job description or a relationship status, that person is vulnerable in a very specific and very serious way. Vulnerable to the particular kind of collapse that happens when the external structures shift, when the career ends, when the children leave, when the relationship that has been organizing everything is suddenly absent, when the identity that the person has been living inside for 30 years is no longer available as the answer to the question of who they are. These transitions can be, and often are, genuinely devastating. Not because the losses are not real. They are. but because the person has, in the decades of building the outer life, neglected to build and maintain a strong enough inner life to sustain them when the outer one changes. Marden advocates for what he calls the practice of returning, which he describes in several different ways across the book, but which always points to the same thing: the regular, deliberate, unhurried practice of going inward, of sitting with yourself, in silence or in whatever form of reflection works for you, with no agenda, except honest contact with your own experience, of asking, not anxiously, but with genuine curiosity, what do I actually feel? What do I actually value beneath what I am supposed to value? What am I doing this for, really? What is the life I am living in service of? These are not comfortable questions, and Marden knows they are not comfortable. But he says, with the authority of someone who has asked them consistently and survived the answers, that they are the questions that keep a life honest, that they are the maintenance work without which the inner life grows dusty and strange, and the outer life, no matter how impressive it looks from a distance, loses its roots. He describes his own practice of early mornings, of waking before the house was awake, and sitting with the particular quality of early light and the particular silence before the day's obligations began, not to plan or to review or to organize, but simply to be. To notice what was present in him before the demands of the day started shaping his responses to everything. These mornings, he says, were not a luxury. They were a necessity, as necessary as sleep, as necessary as food. They were the time when he remained or returned to himself, when he remembered what he was doing all of this for, when he could hear, beneath the noise of everything he had to do, the quieter signal of what he actually wanted to be. This practice of inner renewal is, in his telling, not just good for the individual. It is good for everyone around them. A person who has lost contact with their own depths, who is running entirely on the surface, has less to give. They are less genuinely present, less genuinely kind, less genuinely available to the people they love. The inner life is not a selfish luxury, it is the source from which everything else comes. And tending it is not a withdrawal from the world, it is the preparation for a more genuine re-engagement with it. He talks, too, about the relationship between beauty and moral clarity, which is one of the more unusual arguments in the book and one of the ones that has stayed with me longest. He says that people who have maintained a genuine capacity for beauty, who can be genuinely moved by the natural world, by music, by art, by the small and daily instances of grace that present themselves in any ordinary life, are people who have a kind of natural immunity to certain forms of moral coarsening, that the capacity for beauty and the capacity for genuine ethical feeling are deeply connected, that the person who can no longer be moved by beauty has often, simultaneously, lost some of their capacity for compassion, for genuine empathy, for the imaginative leap into another person's experience that underlies the most important forms of human decency. He is not prescribing a course in art appreciation, he is making a psychological observation that aliveness, in all its forms, is connected, that the person who is alive to beauty is more alive to suffering too, more alive to joy, to love, to the full spectrum of what it means to be present in the world as a human being, and that the gradual deadening that happens in a life, lived without enough attention, without enough genuine presence, without enough of the practices that keep a person in genuine contact with their own experience, that deadening is not selective. It dulls everything, and the way to counteract it is not dramatic. It is the daily, humble, sometimes inconvenient practice of staying awake. Marden writes, near the very end of the book, about what he considers the greatest single act of courage available to a human being, and I want to close with it, because it is not what you might expect. He does not name climbing mountains or building empires or enduring public suffering with grace. The greatest act of courage, he says, is the decision to be genuinely, completely, without reservation happy. To allow yourself to be fully alive in the life you actually have, without waiting for some future version of it that is more deserving of your full presence. To stop qualifying your joy. To stop saying I will be truly happy when, and instead to say this is my life. These people, this morning, this ordinary and specific and utterly irreplaceable moment. This is it. And it is enough for me to be entirely here for it. That is a harder thing than it sounds, because fully inhabiting your own life means accepting the parts of it that are not perfect. It means being happy even though some things are not resolved, not in the way you hoped, not yet. It means being present even in the passages of uncertainty and imperfection and ordinary difficulty that no life is without. It means refusing the comfortable deferral of your own aliveness and claiming it, stubbornly and tenderly, and with whatever practice and patience it requires, in the only time it is actually available to you. And that, Marden says, is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. That is the message of the joys of living. That is what Orison Swett Marden worked his way through an extraordinary, difficult, genuinely triumphant life to understand and to share. And if even one part of this has found its way into some true and useful part of you today, then it has done exactly what it was meant to do. There is so much more in the full book, more stories, more specific practices, more of the careful, detailed, deeply human wisdom that Marden accumulated across a life that had every reason to be bitter and chose, again and again, to be grateful. Find it, read it slowly, read it more than once. Books like this tend to mean different things at different seasons of your life, and the best reason to return to them is that you will find each time that you have become someone different enough to receive them differently. But for now, before you go, one small and specific thing to carry into your day. Just one. Ignore everything else if you need to. But hold on to this. Today, whatever is scheduled, whatever is pressing, whatever feels heavy, take 10 minutes. Set a timer if you need to. And in those 10 minutes, do only one thing. Notice what is good, not what should be better, not what is missing, not what is at risk, just what is actually, specifically, undeniably good. The light in the room right now. The fact of your own breathing, which your body has been doing for you without complaint for every moment of your life. The person or people in your life who would notice if you were gone. The small competence you have in some area that you have never given yourself credit for. The idea you had last week that you have not yet acted on but that still feels alive when you think about it. Something, anything. Just look for it, and then let yourself actually see it. It sounds almost insultingly simple. And if Marden were sitting across from you right now, with that particular quality of warmth and directness and complete absence of condescension that you can feel even through the page, he would tell you that yes, it is that simple. And it is exactly that powerful, because it is the beginning of a habit that, practiced with some consistency over time, will change not just how you feel on any given day, but the entire quality of the life you are living. Not by changing what is in it, by changing the quality of attention you bring to it, by making you, finally and genuinely, present for the life that is already yours. Start there. Start today. Start small, and trust that small, done with genuine intention, has a power that grand gestures planned for someday rarely do. There is one final thing worth saying before we truly close, something that does not fit neatly into any of the themes we have covered, but that runs underneath all of them like groundwater. It is about time, about the specific, irreversible, non-negotiable fact that time is moving, always, in one direction, and that every day spent not in genuine contact with your own life is a day you cannot get back. Marden was not a morbid writer. He had none of the sour quality of someone who wields mortality as a weapon to induce guilt or urgency. But he was clear-eyed about time in a way that some of the most joyful people tend to be, in the paradoxical way that an awareness of impermanence, real and felt rather than just intellectually acknowledged, tends to sharpen rather than diminish the capacity for joy. When you know, in your body and not just your mind, that this is temporary, that the people you love will not always be here, that you yourself will not always be here, that the morning light currently coming through your window will not wait while you finish your inbox, something in the experience of ordinary life becomes more vivid, more precious, more worth the full, unhurried weight of your attention. He tells a story about a woman he knew who was diagnosed with a serious illness in her late 40s and given a year to live, which turned out to be wrong, as these diagnoses sometimes mercifully are. She recovered, but the year she spent believing she would not change her relationship to her own life in ways that never entirely reversed. She described the first autumn after she received the diagnosis as the most beautiful autumn of her life. Not because the leaves were more vivid than in other years, but because she was more vivid, more there, more fully installed in her own experience. She walked through her neighbourhood and felt the tears arriving, not from grief, but from a kind of overflowing gratitude that she had not known before, had not known was possible, had not known she was missing until the threat of losing everything removed the layer of distance that had been between her and her own life. She told Marden, years later when she was well, that she wished she could give everyone that experience without the terror that had accompanied it. The experience of waking up to your own life, of seeing the October trees and understanding, in some cellular way, rather than just an intellectual one, that you are alive right now, in this improbable and unrepeatable and genuinely extraordinary fact of being here at all. She said, I had been sleepwalking. I had been living at a remove from my own experience for so long that I had forgotten the remove was there. I thought that was just what life felt like. I did not know that life could feel the way it felt that autumn, when I was finally too frightened and too grateful and too aware of what I might be losing to be anywhere except completely in it. Marden says, with the gentleness of someone who is not trying to frighten anyone, only to wake them, you do not have to wait for a diagnosis. You do not have to wait for a crisis to give you permission to be fully alive. The permission is already yours. It was always yours. The question is only whether you will use it. Use it today. Use it in the conversation you are about to have. Use it in the meal you are about to eat. Use it in the work you will do this afternoon, and in the face you look into this evening, and in the quiet moment before sleep when the whole day is gathered and still, and you can, if you let yourself, feel the particular weight and texture of having been, today, genuinely, actually, completely alive. That is the whole of it. That is what Orison Swett Marden wanted to leave us with. Not a system, not a formula, not a set of steps that, followed correctly, will guarantee a particular outcome. Just this: the joys of living are not elsewhere, not later, not contingent on conditions that have not yet been met. They are here. They have always been here. And you, exactly as you are, in the life you are actually living, with all its imperfections and its ongoing uncertainties and its moments of difficulty and its surprising, persistent, renewable beauty, you are the person they are waiting for. Go live it, all of it, with everything you have. And if you find as you practice these things that some days are easier than others, that some mornings the habit of presence comes naturally and other mornings you have to work for it, Marden would simply say, good. That is what practice is. That is what it means to be human and to be trying. The days when it is hard are not failures. They are the days that matter most. They are the days when the practice becomes real, when the choice is genuinely a choice rather than a reflex, when you are building something in yourself that will be there for you in the harder seasons that will eventually come. Be patient with yourself on those days. Be the good friend to yourself that Marden talks about throughout this book. Start again with as little drama as possible from exactly where you are. That is all. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. The life you want is not waiting somewhere else for you to deserve it. It is the life you are already in, seen more clearly, lived more fully, inhabited with more of the presence and the gratitude and the genuine engagement that you are always capable of. That is the joy Marden is pointing at. That is the joy that is already yours. And it has been there all along, patient as water, steady as the ground beneath you, waiting only for the quality of attention that finally lets you see it for what it actually is. Your life. Your one, actual, irreplaceable, worth being fully present for life. Starting, always and again, exactly here. Before we end, if you got something real from this, something useful or something that made you think or remember or want to do something differently, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Audiobook Library. It matters more than you might think. Every like, every subscription, every comment where you share what stayed with you, it is what makes this channel real, what makes this work sustainable, and what makes it possible for more people to find these ideas when they need them most. So thank you from everyone here for being present with this today. And please, do go and explore the rest of our channel. We have a full library of audiobook summaries waiting for you, books about how to live with more courage, more creativity, more genuine connection, more of the things that make a human life feel worth the effort of living it. Find the next one that speaks to where you are right now. Because these conversations are ones we want to keep having with you, and the library is large, and somewhere in it there is almost certainly exactly what you need to hear next. Take good care of yourself. Be generous with your attention today, starting with the life you already have. And remember what Orison Swett Marden spent his one remarkable, difficult, hard-earned, genuinely joyful life trying to remind us. The joys of living are already here. They are already yours. They are waiting, patiently and without judgment, in the only moment that has ever actually existed, which is this one, right here, the one you are living in right now. Welcome to it. Welcome home.